So welcome everyone tonight to another event that is part of the National Being Human Festival of the Humanities. It's taking place between the 12th and 22nd of November, and it's the only National Festival of the Humanities run through the School of Advanced Study, the University of London, and it partners with the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the British Academy. All the events are going to be online this year. And you can follow more at Being Human Fest or hashtag Being Human 2020. And if anybody feels like making a donation, feel free to go there. And there are surveys, and you'll get a survey as part of the response to this event. And they are important. I know sometimes they feel a little bit after, so leave it a day or two, but do send something back, because, you know, for the speakers, I think it's really good to get some feedback on what the event's been like. So thank you for that in advance. The first thing I'm going to do is cover some housekeeping. I've already said you can keep as many crumbs on the desk as you like and leave things draped over radiators. That's not the kind of housekeeping we're interested in. But today, with this being a webinar, there's a Q&A at the bottom of the screen. There's a chat which we encourage you to use, talk to each other throughout the event, make comments, reflections, any of your own experiences. Feel free to share them on there. There's also a Q&A button. What I'm intending to do is, when we get past the two presentations and we've heard the talks and the fascinations, what they're prompting you, as you think of a question to either Jamie or to Cynthia, use the Q&A button, and I will take questions directly from there and read them out on your behalf. There may be times where the question might be, well, we might have some discussion where we'd like to bring you in which case we'll make that happen at the time. But what we're really anticipating is that you'll be invisible and silent, and there's a lot of you, and it's a short time, so I think that's going to work better. But we might bring you in. We'll wait and see. But do use the Q&A. It would be lovely to get some questions for you. Okay, and now on with the good stuff. So I'm going to introduce our two speakers. Cynthia Johnson is a book historian at the Institute of English Studies at the School of Advanced Study, the University of London. She's a medievalist by training and is currently the course tutor for the MA in the History of the Institute at IES. Since 2013, she has been researching the collectors of the Northwest, beginning first with Robert Edward Hart, whose collection of books and coins are held by the Blackburn Museum. Hart has led her on to the collections of James Dunn at the Blackburn with Darwin Library and Information Centre, Edward Hardcastle at Townley Hall Museum and Art Gallery in Burnley, as well as Henry Spencer and Joseph Pomfret at the Harris Museum in Preston. Her forthcoming book, A British Book Collector, Rare Books and Manuscripts in the R.E. Hart Collection, Blackburn Museum and Art Gallery, brings together new research on Hart and his collections by academics from around the world. I think actually it's impressive and actually inspirational. I've met Cynthia a couple of times now online as we prepare for this, and I have been inspired, and I'm really looking forward to tonight. And I think what'll probably work better is if I just let Cynthia go now, and I'll introduce Jamie just before he speaks. That'll make a little bit more logistical sense. So Cynthia, over to you.
Okay, great, thanks. Right, okay. Right, I'm going to just share my screen now, and off we go. So I'm just going to say a few words about Hart and Mr. Dunn. Sorry, it's not, hang on one sec. Having a little trouble with my PowerPoint. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so I'm just going to give a quick introduction to these two collectors that we're discussing tonight. We're talking about cultures of collecting, creativity, and the pursuit of curiosity during the second half of the 19th century through the first decades of the 20th century. And I'm using Jamie's image here from Transform and Escape the Dogs to conjure up the idea of freedom that intellectual pursuit can bring. And both of the men that we're discussing tonight made escapes as I perceive it, from societal constraints through passionate pursuit of rare books, really, for both of them, in the context of their working lives here in Blackburn. James Dunn, who's over there on the left, this is the only photograph that we have of James Dunn. It's from his obituary, as you can see, from 1943. He was a draper. He had a shop on Montague Street in Blackburn, and he lived over the shop with his family. We don't know anything really at all about his education. We think he left school probably at 14 and went straight to work in the family business. Hart on the right there, he was known as Edward Hart, and their family business was rope. And he took over the family business after the death of his father. So he's following in the footsteps of 4 previous generations. Hart lived his whole life in this house, which is called Brooklands. It still stands. It's on West Park Road, and it overlooks Corporation Park. So it's a brick villa, and it's built by a member of the family. And it's, you know, it's a nice house, but it's not like one of the incredibly palatial sort of cotton king houses that you see in Blackburn as well. And down the hill from Brooklands was Mr. Dunn's shop on Montague Street. So Dunn doesn't specialize in ladies' gowns or, you know, silks or whatever. They sell drapery, general drapery, oilcloths, linoleum, stuff like that. And their motto, which is brilliant, which you can see here, is maximum value at minimum price. So the Harts had invented this thing called the Lambeth Power Rope, and it was made from cotton waste. It brought the power in from outside of the mill to run the machines, the machinery inside. And as you can see from all the languages here, it was sold all over the world, and it made them incredibly rich. So Hart went away to boarding school at Rugby, and then he went to Cambridge, where he read mechanical engineering. And Dunn, as I've said, went straight into work at the draper shop. But Hart too came back to Blackburn, and he also goes right into the family business. So neither of these guys ever owned a car. And I think they must have often seen each other in town, walking to work or taking the tram. And they lived less than a mile apart all their lives. So they're separated by money, by class, by education, and by religion. Dunn attended the Primitive Methodist Chapel on Montague Street, which has been knocked down. And Hart attended St. Silas's, which was like the, you know, high church place. But they seem to have known each other well. There's a report of Dunn's funeral, which records that Edward Hart was one of the mourners. So I don't have any hard evidence for this, but I'm convinced that it's their passion for books that brought them together. So Dunn's collection is held by the Blackburn with Darwin Library and Information Service. There are about 500 books, which include stuff like this incredibly rare early printed book. This is an Erasmus. It's printed in London in 1536. I think there are 2 other copies in the UK and maybe 5 worldwide. You've got beautiful 18th century prints. He's got tons of these. He absolutely loves them. He buys a lot of them in Paris. He's taught himself French in midlife because he wants to go and buy books. So that's what he does. And this is one of the most incredible things that I found in the Dunn collection. This is an autographed manuscript of an unknown plot. Dunn thought this was written by Charles Dickens, and it's in an album of correspondence between Dickens and various different people. This is written on stationery from Gad's Hill Place. It's Dickens' own home, but we figured out that this is not actually Dickens' hand. It's a hand of somebody called Charles Collins, Wilkie Collins's brother. And it was part of a competition that was held at Dickens' house one weekend. Anyway, every one of Donne's books has a note inside it, and you can see it here on the left. And he tells you why the book's important, why he's bought it, why it's in his collection, and he always signs it JD. So Hart's collection is, there are about 1,000 books. These are in the Blackburn Museum and Art Gallery. He's collected the whole history of the written word. So these are cuneiform tablets, which were made in ancient Mesopotamia, about 2000 BC. They're written in cuneiform script, the first recorded written language. He's got incredible whole collection of Islamic manuscripts. These are cuttings from an unidentified Islamic manuscript. Hart thought he was buying something called the Shamana, which is the national poem of Iran still to this day. But in fact, on the back of these cuttings, there's more script, and it's been noted that this is in prose, it's not in verse. And this manuscript is still unidentified, but it's absolutely amazing. He's got a Quran, he's got three guides to goodnesses. Anyway, it's amazing. He also has medieval manuscripts. This is one of my favorite ones. It's by someone called an anonymous medieval painter called the Master of Edward IV. And check out these really bizarre devils down here that are dragging these people down to hell. And here we've got the story of David and Goliath in the bottom, and Goliath has taken one right to the head. Absolutely unreal. Anyway, and also Hart's coins. This is one of the most important collections of coins worldwide. Only one other place has got a complete collection of Roman imperial coins. That means every single emperor, and that's the British Museum. And of course, Blackburn Museum and Art Gallery. So yeah, that's a very brief intro to both of these people. So Peter, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Cynthia. It never gets, there's just so much that comes from there. And I love that image of Blackburn down the hill. It still looks very much the same. Maybe not as much smoke coming out of the chimneys, but there's a lot that's familiar there. Okay, thank you. And we'll come back and we'll talk more as we get Jamie through, and then we'll the conversation bringing these two things together. So I'm going to introduce Jamie, who's a good friend of mine, I'm pleased to say. He might not repeat that back on terms, but so Jamie Holman leads the fine arts at Blackburn College and works from a studio in the town centre. He is director of Prism Contemporary Gallery in Blackburn and a non-executive director of the National Festival of Making. Jamie's work is multidisciplinary and is often fabricated using industrial processes or with heritage craft makers and artists. His work is informed by the heritage of working class communities, in particular the impact of the Industrial Revolution and the cultures that have manifested as a consequence of its emergence and then subsequent decline. Jamie also works as one half of Uncultured Creatives, a collaboration with producer Alex Zawadaski, delivering works in public, digital, print and traditional gallery spaces. He is currently also the Associate Artist for the British Textile Biennial 2021. Okay, Jamie, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks, Cynthia. Right, I'm going to do the share screen roulette now. Okay. I'm going to start. I'm an artist and I'm interested in the heritage of places like Blackburn. and particularly Blackburn, because the context starts where we are right now, in that Blackburn is one of the towns classed as having the least engagement with art and culture in the country, whatever that means. And a lot of the work that I'm involved in with the gallery, with the National Festival of Making, the Textile Biennial, and with the museum, contests that and challenges it. And so I'm interested in telling a different story. So I'm going to start with this slide from Jeanette Winterson, my hero, the writer from Accrington, who talks about a story being a series of connected events, real or imagined, imagined or real. So some of the things that I'm connecting are real and some of them are imagined. And this is Blackburn, this is my Blackburn, and the Blackburn of Heart and Dun. And in a really small geography, the exciting thing for this research, for the research Cynthia brings and for the research that I've been involved in, is there's this extraordinary explosion of culture in this really small geography, in this place where culture is not supposed to be. It's a place that culture is meant to come to and save us, but obviously doesn't get here very often and should never come from there. So the hair motif that, that Cynthia used for the piece of work that I made is an old symbol. It's an ancient symbol. It's an international symbol for transformation. This is a medieval manuscript with that shows hares restraining this dog. And that, for me, is the story, is a provocation for what I'm calling uncultured creativity. All of these activities in this small geography is about transforming and escaping the dogs, and that is often, for the people I'm going to discuss, the workplace, the mills, their circumstances, the move from the rural to the industrial, and the need to transform into something else, to become artists or poets or to collect books, and the curiosity that transformation facilitates. So I like to think that this is Heart and Dun, transforming, but I also like to think that it's James Sharples. This is in the Victorian Painting Gallery in the museum, where in the first Textile Biennial and working in the Festival of Making, I've been involved in looking at the collection with Rebecca Johnson and with the team there. And I think people know who've seen me talk about this before how much I love the Forge. And the thing about the Forge and James Sharples is that he's one of the people that's happening in this small geography. And he's working in this forge, waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning to paint before he goes to work in heavy industry at 5 o'clock in the morning. But there's all sorts of activity happening during the Industrial Revolution. And perhaps most surprisingly is the amount of poetry and how many poets there are in Blackburn, mill poets. And George Hull released this book, The Poets and Poetry of Blackburn, trying to capture and trying to establish this proposition that this town is a place of culture and of curiosity and learning. And what I love about this poetry is that much of it is in Blackburn dialect, in that vernacular. But this is my favourite of the Blackburn poets, and this is Wiliam Bilington. And Wiliam Bilington was a really interesting guy. He was born in Samlesbury on the site of Roachbridge Mill, practically, and was, as a kid, was dragged in from this rural childhood where he used to pick bulrushes in the Ribble and sell them in Blackburn Market. He was dragged into the mills, like all of that generation and generations that would follow him, and he hated it. He hated working in the mills. But he was also died as James Sharples was, as it looks like Dun was, taught himself the classics, would recite the classics, but was a really prolific poet. I think it's important to sort of place Blackburn in the world as well. I don't want to be really provincial about Blackburn when we talk about it and just be celebratory of these things without a bigger context. When Wiliam Bilington was writing, it was the American Civil War, the cotton mills were at the forefront of the dialogue around the struggle for between North and South and to free slaves and for the changing world order that was coming. And this is a really good example of this Blackburn dialect. And even though I think I do have quite a broad Blackburn Lancashire accent, I don't think it's as broad as this, but I'm just going to have a go. Some factory masters talk for the South with a smooth and oily tongue, but if they'd sensed, they'd shut their mouths or sing another song. Let liberty, not slavery, be fostered and extended. 4 million slaves must yet be free, and then the war be ended. And this is the world that these people were living in. It's not the nostalgia of the Facebook pages that we know. It's not the narrow world of heritage that we're often told over and over, which there's a place for. But it's not just flat caps and cotton mills. Lancashire weavers were engaged in the world. And this book was key for my research because it places Blackburn as a radical place because of these activities. Round the corner on Northgate, at this time, Mitchell and Kenyon are making some of the first films that we know. And they actually make the first Western, Kidnapped by Indians. And the link there is that obviously this was what people were talking about in Blackburn. They were talking about the South, they were talking about slavery, and the poets were talking about it and reciting the poets in mills, in pubs and on the streets in Blackburn. So this culture starts to manifest. This is Mitchell and Kenyon, textile workers leaving a mill in 1901. And this is their great-grandchildren returning to those empty mills in convoys for Acid House in 1990, reimagining the empty spaces that the Industrial Revolution left behind, abandoned by cotton, and forming new cultures again. This is a Mitchell and Kenyon banner parade, capturing the political voices of the day. And this really is a link to the kind of work that I make. These are new banners that I've made to memorialise contemporary cultures that are emerging in Blackburn, again, in this place that is supposed to have the least engagement with art and culture in the country. So these are my banners at Durham Miners Gala in 2019. They were made for the Textile Biennial. They are gallery pieces, but they're also traditionally made hand-painted silk banners. So it's important that they also went out and did the same things that those original banners did. And this is the first Western performance. That's people queuing right up at Northgate, round the corner from the museum, with a banner to go back to the Cotton Exchange and watch the first Western. So a memorial banner for Acid House, a memorial banner for the first Western, and a memorial banner for all of those people who were transformed through autodidact curiosity, through emerging education, and through knowing each other, through forming these communities of curiosity that would become communities of practice. This is Wiliam Bilington's poem, Blackburn to the Fore, in 1873, I think. And it captures the optimism of that time. And this is printed on tissue paper at Roach Bridge, so printed at the printers that have been there. It was a cotton mill very briefly, then a paper mill, and then a printer's. So printed on the site of his birth and distributed in the museum during the Festival of Making's Legacy exhibition and at the first National Festival of Making. And I'm going to play you a performance in a second. I scored it to choral for a choral performance, and there's a film of that which I'm going to play. But you might be able to see on your screens, pick out some of these. Some of the verse before you hear it. And what's exciting for me about this is that it's optimism. It talks about the cotton trade in infancy, its feet beginning to feel, but it talks about the emergence of the football culture, the Football League, Blackburn Olympic at the time, and 2 seconds away from Blackburn being one of the founding teams of the Football League, and all of the cultures that would emerge from that. There's a great line in it, feet foremost to the grave men go, thus wiseacres deplore. Which I love. But he also talks about some of those curiosity, those curious cultures that emerge in the entrepreneurial spirit. He talks about the spinning jenny. He talks about the impact of education, the technical college where I work and where art studios still function is about to open. And that's what is exciting about this time for me, and I make artwork to memorialise that, contemporary artworks, because the collision in this small geography of all of these activities, all of these new ideas, comes just before Dunn and Hart start to collect and bring in new works against the odds. And what's really exciting, I suppose, for me is that in this place, there's no glamour to Blackburn, is there? There's no studying at Blackburn College or the museum. It's not the place that people immediately associate with these important cultures, but they are important cultures. And you can see all this stuff in that library. It's there. And you can see it in the architecture around us, and you can see it in the fact that there are kids in Milan wearing Adidas trainers named after pubs in Blackburn. So I think that there's a phrase that a lot of the ex-acid house people use, which is if you know, you know. And it's just a shame that a lot of people don't know. But I'm going to finish my bit with the film Blackburn to the Fore, which was shown at the first National Festival of Making in 2017. It was performed by the Blackburn People's Choir, and I scored the words of the poem loosely to the tune of the Union song Joe Hill, and it was performed twice over the weekend in the cathedral. So hopefully this will play.
Struggling with the rising line of kings, your conscience crushed and bleeding, solidarity and wings. The moral sky grew dark for lack of true religious law. Then the Reverend Bolton brought up Blackburn to the fore. Our cotton trading infancy's feet began to feel. The single spinning meant a woman to a wheel. The loom the spinster left behind in Lancashire all over. Henry's with his Jenny Marshall Blackburn to the fore. In education, Blackburn claims to stand on higher ground. In authorship to more than rival many towns around. And now she greets her trained athletes round the Olympic hall. Winning England's Challenge Cup brings Blackburn to the fore. But football's an unholy game, 'tis rude and most unmeet. But England's future manhood thirst should educate their feet. Feet foremost to the brave men go, the wiseacres deplore. Football has at least done this, brought Blackburn to the fore. In the good, the golden future, may our town enjoy the taste. The talent still increasing, rich and glorified and praised. Her cotton kirtled daughters and the sons of Sable Hall. Industry and skill will still keep Blackburn to the fore.
Okay. Industry and skill will still bring Blackburn to the fore. It's a great final line of the piece, I think.
Fabulous.
Have we lost Mr. Shuki?
No, I'm here. Can you see me? Am I there?
There you are.
That was excellent. Thank you, Jamie, and thank you, Cynthia. It was such great. Actually, you know, you're coming at it from different angles, but there's so much overlap, isn't there? And I think that's going to come through in the discussion. And I hope that people just start throwing things in the Q&A. I've got quite a few from Paul Mason, and thank you, Paul.
Hi, Paul.
One of the first ones, and it's to Cynthia this, and I know some of the truth of this have done, but I don't for Hart. Paul asked, did Hart understand the books he was buying? So was he a linguist? I mean, he had multiple languages, didn't he, that he was purchasing in?
Yeah, I would say that Hart, he probably had some knowledge of Latin, but I don't think he was very good at it. And he certainly didn't understand Greek. He didn't, I think that I think he knew a bit of French as well, but he wasn't buying these books to really read them. Hart is really interested in the visual aspects of these books. All his medieval manuscripts are highly illuminated. You've got these this incredible series of pictures. He's interested in his early printed books. He's really interested in where they were made. And he tries to get examples from early printed books from as many places as possible in Europe. Donne, I think, reads his books. And they're all, most of them are in English and some are in French, but Donne went out and taught himself French. And so, yeah, he engaged, I think, perhaps more actively in terms of reading.
Okay. Yeah, I really love that I've done that. He did teach himself French and to go. I mean, you told me previously that you thought that was so he could drive a harder bargain when he got to Paris. So,
it is, yeah, I think so, definitely. Yeah, for sure.
It's something that we sort of just gloss over. It's easy to sort of say it even in a conversation like this. Bilington was the same. He taught himself the classics and he didn't go to school. He could recite Shakespeare. And imagine that working life and teaching yourself French. I think, Cynthia, you used the phrase when we had when we were having a cup of tea in Rhode Island, I'm sure you used the phrase candlelight scholar.
Yeah.
Which I told to Peter and we were both enamored by.
Yeah.
Because it's sort of the aesthetic reality of how difficult it would have been to study. Just, we work all day, like Sharples getting up to paint. I'm in awe of these people because of that drive. That's drive for scholarship. To teach yourself French is difficult enough.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a guy, Henry Spencer, who collects books in Preston, and he is a mill worker. He's not like sort of a sort of a white collar worker like Hart or like Donne, really. And Spencer lives in a boarding house. He gets home at night. He's given his candle, and that's meant to last him for quite some time. And there's not a wax candle, so this is tallow. And he describes his experience of going upstairs, and he got himself a copy of Keats' Endymion, and he started to read it. And he reads it until the candle goes poof, it's done, and it's getting light outside. So he goes downstairs the next morning, and the lady who runs the boarding house is like, "So you use the whole candle? Great. So you can pay for another one." So anyway, so this goes on, but he can't put the book down. Yeah, which I just think is lovely. Yeah,
incredible. I think there's a link into another question that Paul's put in, because I think that the idea of language is significant and learning language, and Paul brings up the mill poets and the Blackburn poets and asks whether they were writing for people in Blackburn, and I get the feeling that not. But I want Jamie, would you respond to that? I think it's a great question. Who was the target audience for?
It's a really, really, really good question, and I think Paul probably knows more about the mill poets in general than I do. But I've got a really narrow research lens that I'm looking through, particularly at Bilington, because of that Festival Making Commission. But I am enamoured by all of the activity around it. But if you look at the poems, there are two distinct types that come out from those collections. There are poems written in the dialect, and there are poems called Bilington wrote a famous poem called Blackburn as It Is. So they're very much of the day, very much for local audiences, I think, and they were performative. And after he finished working the mills, Bilington had a pub on, I think, Nab Lane and Bradshaw Street. Again, not far, it's in this very small geography. And it was known as Poets' Corner, and the poets used to gather there. And it was really, these poems were performed to people before they were written. But there is also a sort of ambition around those poets. Particularly, that comes through in Hull's book. There is a growing ambition to be taken seriously, and the poems change and they become more. They become less vernacular, and they become more informed by what's going on in the rest of the country and the fashions of poetry. But I think that fundamentally, the mill poets, it was about Blackburn. It was about their situation, and you see that in the example that I used because they're talking about what's happening to them. I think there's another line in where Bilington talks about it will be easier for them if the war was over, but the moral question is bigger than the impact on them. And I think that he was a bit of a militant, and he was definitely using poetry to spread those messages. And I think it's a bit of both, Paul. But you probably know. Well, I imagine you know more than me.
We could maybe bring Paul in. Paul, if you type something in chat about whether you're happy with that, I'll come back to you, because I think that'd be an interesting discussion. While we're on poetry, there are questions coming in the Q&A, and thank you very much for those. But there is a link. Alison Cooper asks, is there much research around women dialect poets from Blackburn around this time? And if so, are they writing about similar themes? Which is a great question. Thank you.
It is a great question. And there's a PhD, Exeter University are collecting and making these poems online and recording them. There's a big PhD project happening that I became aware of around the time we published the artwork for, because I'm not an expert on the mill poets. I'm an artist responding to some of these cultures, and there are definitely female voices. And I think that the whole, Rebecca will know as well, the whole drive of the Exeter project is to capture the diversity of that poetry and make it all visible. And I think there is a website. I'll try and get it in the chat. But yes, there definitely were women poets, and I do think they were talking about similar things from my limited knowledge. But I also know from the research from the collection of the museum that one of the first trade union formed in the country was formed by women in Blackburn, and we've got Rebecca has the banner. And it's the Union of Weavers, Wefters and Warpers, I think. And it's a really famous, I keep saying famous, in these circles, it's a really known banner, a really important banner that's in the collection. And there was a women's group from Blackburn who were at Peterloo, for instance. And so I have encountered poems that are politicised by those women, but they're definitely capturing that Exeter project.
Mm. I haven't found any female collectors, unfortunately, in this period. And if anyone knows of any, I'd be really, really happy to hear from you. Yeah, that's to me, that's an unfortunate lapse. But anyway, I'd like to know.
Okay, thanks, Cynthia. I'm going to finish with a Paul question, not finish the event, but finish Paul's questions that he's asked us. That did organised religion help to drive artistic output? I'm going to come to this before I go to the Q&As, because I didn't really see that in what was said, but I know I'm read in Holding the Vision. There was an element of religion around some of the background of some of the collectors. And I suppose the question is around the poets as well, if you know anything around that, Jamie.
I think in terms of Donne, I don't know. I don't know. I know that he's a primitive Methodist, but I don't think he sort of he didn't even have his funeral there. I don't know how much he attended or paid attention. Hart is involved with St. Silas's, and he certainly has a lot of, I think, sort of a deep belief. And he also gave a big stained glass window to St. Silas's in memory of his parents. And he also gave a church window to the church at Salisbury as well. So yeah, I don't know, but I'm not sure how much that informs his collecting, really. But I think one thing that's really interesting that he feels he's giving to the community in that way. And I think that what Jamie has been talking about in terms of creative cultures in Blackburn, these people who, Hart and Donne, who gave their collections to the town, that was their contribution also to this culture, because this stuff was left to, in quotes, the people of the town. So even though the British Museum they were after Hart's books and they are after his coins, and he said no. He left them to his people, to his town.
I don't know the answer in terms of the poets, to be honest, because the space. I mean, that is a space, isn't it, where communities would have gathered, and where there would be a voice in the town. But the spaces I've been interested in have been the workplace, so the mills and the factories, and then the other spaces that emerged around where people gathered. So a lot of the language in some of that work that I made, and there's a lot of work from the past couple of years, is that when we gather, we become powerful, and this whole idea of gathering in these spaces, the emerging football grounds, the mills, the factories, the new civic buildings. But I guess the churches obviously would have also played a part in that. Bilington talks about the Reverend Bolton in Blackburn to the Fore, but he's sort of really critical of everything in all his poems. It's why I like him so much. And I know that he does. He does give the clergy a bit of a knocking, but that's not enough for me to sort of put my flag in the ground for the answer. But yeah.
Okay, thank you both. Good answers and great questions. I've got a question which I like the sound of, but the name of the asker is 059715, and you'd be more at home up here with me on the space station. That'll be the future. We're just going to have numbers, not names. But the question is this: cotton and wool presumably created very wealthy people. Do other northern towns have similar collectors or cultural development? Or is this something peculiar to Blackburn? I think partly I know the answer because of some of the Cynthia's work, but how would you respond to that? How broad was this culture of collecting?
I think it's really broad spread, and it's part of that Victorian DNA. It's part of their sort of compulsion to sort of examine, collect, organize the world. I mean, people like Ruskin are talking about everybody collecting things, collections of curiosities for each person. I mean, this culture is certainly going on right around this area. It's going on in Accrington, it's going on in Burnley, and certainly in Preston. Preston has got, for whatever reason, lots of book collectors, and certainly and Blackburn as well.
I think that the Ruskin things, I'll answer the question about other places in terms of art making, but Ruskin's really interesting because it is very much of that time, isn't it, Cynthia? The sort of better yourself, pull yourself up. Ruskin wrote numerous letters to James Sharples. James Sharples was celebrated for being, a common man who bettered himself.
Yeah.
He was praised for that, and he had a brief moment of, that was a moment of fame, I think, because he was held in high regard. It was very much of the time, but I don't know about collections, but as a consequence of other industries. But I was working on a commission in East Durham last year for a year in former mining communities. So literally on the other side of the country, on the East Coast, and there's an incredible autodidact culture there of pit painting. Not just the banners, not just the trade union banners, which is what drew me there, but actually, miners come back from work. And again, I think that I was on a discussion that Rebecca ran with the designer Craig Oldham, who's a really great guy, really interesting guy, who makes a lot of design work informed by a mining heritage. His dad was a striking miner, and he said a great phrase. It was like, these guys went to work every day and fought the ground. They were underground and fought stone for a living, and then they go home and they do the tin bath, and then they make paintings, and there is also poetry. And so, I guess that because wherever these industries are, you think about fishing industries, cultures emerge regardless. These working class cultures manifest. It'd just be interesting to see if the collector gene follows there as well, whether there are people there, but certainly that that idea of uncultured creativity manifests wherever these people gather in the workplace somehow.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jamie. I'm going to, I'm sort of jumping between the questions to try and follow threads. There's a really great question from Ian Matheson that I want to bring up in a second. But
Sure.
Venice Queens has got a great question too. And it links a little bit back to something we've already discussed, but I think it ties into this conversation we've just had. Where did the money come from? And Venice Queen asks, Sharples created the forge, and who did he paint that for? And also, I mean, it's a fabulous piece of art, but it too must have been expensive in relation to the canvas to paint. So what was the drive financially to get these things together? Where did the finance come from?
Oh God! I mean, I don't know, but I just say I'm in awe of it, because there's no doubt. It's like the candle. The currency, the cost. It's like Dunn the Draper saves all of his money to buy a book and will travel to buy a book. He'll go abroad from Blackburn to buy a book. I mean, think what you could do to the impact, to the comfort of your life with that money. It's not just the cost of the materials, which totally is something of a mystery. But it's imagine going to work in a forge. The reality of a forge, you start work at 5 o'clock in the morning, you get up at 3 to paint. I've got students who can't get in for 10 in the morning. But the money, I think it's that incredible drive where people are clearly just saving up every scrap, and probably at the expense of other things, because the desire to create, to transform, the curiosity is overwhelming. Because people like Sharples in particular, he was working 6 days a week, and it took him a long time. It was a long time to paint the forge, and he did have a moment where, helped by people like Ruskin, where he did make some etchings and went into business, and it was a disaster because he wasn't a businessman. But even then, he built his own press and made his own tools. So it's not like he had access to the best of anything. Which is also makes it so extraordinary, I think. But like the candle, that they're sat there reading these books, knowing that the candle is meant to last a month, and it's going to last a night, and it's going to cost money. So that drive for me is a thing. So I have no idea where they got the money from. I just imagine that they went through hardship to do the work.
And Jamie, who do you imagine that Sharples painted the forge for? Was it to send to London? Was it to be exhibited, or what was it for? Who did he imagine his audience would be?
I mean, I don't know. I had a period when I was lost in the research where I did think he was speaking to me, but he never mentioned that, and he did, I really did. And but I think it's. I don't want to answer for him, but I think why any of these people did these things, why they made these works, why they collected these. I think primarily it's for them. Definitely, I think that. People record the world when they make artworks with no understanding of how the world's going to change. There's, the painting of the forge in its time, the content wasn't remarkable. That was the world, and Sharples couldn't have imagined what was to come. He couldn't imagine the empty forge or the empty mill. So there was no reason to sort of do it to capture something for any other reason than for himself, because he wouldn't have had an audience immediately. But I also think that he was driven by that. There's a commonality amongst the collectors, the makers, the poets, the painters, which was to get better. He wanted to get better. He wanted to be a good painter. He definitely wanted to get better. He had books on of anatomy that his brother gave him. He couldn't read for a long time. And he didn't make an awful lot of work because he didn't have the time and the money. So I guess he made it for himself.
Okay, I like that. Cynthia, it's a similar question, because Jill, thank you for the question. She said, were the books expensive? And did they go to buy them in person? And again, I know of Dunn, I'm not sure of Hart. So again, it relates to finance, but also purpose and who they were and how they got the things that they've collected.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think this question of the quest for these things has a lot to do with Donne and Hart breaking out of their expected tram lines where they're meant to, where they're meant to be in their lives, what they're meant to be doing. So Donne, we have evidence that Donne traveled all over the place in pursuit of books. We find him in London, Birmingham, Glasgow, all over the place, Paris, in the pursuit of books. He also went to North Africa, and I don't know if there's anything that he bought there book-wise, but he certainly traveled around. And it says in his obit that he liked to travel using his French, among these sort of, places that were not often visited. So he's breaking the mold there. And he is going into bookshops. He is negotiating with people, buying stuff to take home to Blackburn. And for Hart, he's traveling to places, he's going to places where he's not expected to turn up. So there's a famous story about Hart. He used to take the train down to London, and he'd go and buy books at Mag's, one of the most famous, the oldest bookseller in Europe, in Berkeley Square. There's a story of Hart tipping up with his carpet bag one morning just before the Second War, and he has a look at these 5 books, incredibly rare or early printed books, and he makes a deal with Mr. Maggs, the bookseller, and agrees to buy these things, £5,000 each. So he's spending £25,000 in one morning. And when it's time to pay, he opens the carpet bag and he counts it out in £1 notes. So, he got the price he wanted. But Mr. Maggs, was Mr. Maggs really expecting this guy to come in with this carpet bag and to, probably not. So he's breaking out. He is in his pursuit of these things of beauty that he brings home to Blackburn. The 25 grand is out of the bags. Books are in the bag. Goes back to Euston and takes a train home. So they're breaking boundaries for sure.
How much was he spending that day, Cynthia? Is that I remember you telling me about this, and that's like £1 million, right?
It's more than £1 million. It's about 1.34 million pounds in a morning. And he gave all those books away at the end. He gave them to the Cambridge University Library, and that transformed their collection of early printed books. So he did it very purposefully. Wow. Anyway. Yeah.
He did well with those ropes, didn't he? There's no doubt about that.
Quite literally, Jake, that's what I was going to say. Money for new rope. That guy's found, $1 million. Wow, that is incredible. I was just thinking of the Spencer's books as well, and you're talking to Sharples, Jamie, and these fabulous books called chapbooks, which maybe you'll talk about, Cynthia, but one of them that he bought was the general history of apparitions. So I think that you might be in there, Jamie. I'm going to get to this Ian Matheson question because it's fabulous, and I know me and you have bounced around various buildings talking about this terminology. But Ian asks, he starts with a quote, and you'll be familiar with it. Jake Berry, the MP for Darwin and Rosendale, has recently been quoted as saying that our local idea of culture is the football, echoing Art Council England's summary of our cultural awareness in Blackburn as a pint and the match. Are we banging our heads against a wall with our reputation south of Birmingham? Because we know from what has gone on over the past few years, the Festival of Making, the Textile Biennial, that we in Lancashire are so much more. And if so, what do we need to do to raise our cultural profile? It's a great question, Ian, and I know it's going to have a good response here.
It's a great question, Ian. It's like you've pressed the rant button, so I'm going to try not to. But, the first thing is, there's nothing wrong with that. The visibility of these cultures around things like football. It's a class issue for me. Football emerges from mill workers forming the Football League and is now this incredible international, vibrant culture. So that the first thing is like I feel no shame for. There's no hierarchy in these cultures for me, and you know there wasn't for the people that we're talking about either. They were so curious and pulled all these things together. The sort of real focus of your question about, you know, I talked about Blackburn still being seen through this lens of a place of low art and culture engagement. I think that is about what we class as art and culture to start with, and Mr. Berry's comments reveal that. I think the comments were something like, in London they watch opera or the ballet, and you know, up here our culture is football, and even more problematic is that classification of people, a quiet pint with a match, in a sort of derogatory term, as though it implies that there is no link with cultures. And actually that's exactly what Sharples was up against. It was what Bilington was up against. It was what Dunn was up against. And it's a very, very particular lens, and it's a lens of class, unfortunately. It's what the acid house kids were up against when I was a teenager. And now, you know, I have used this phrase a lot, but it's just so succinct that, you know, one of those kids, Gary Aspden, is now head of a global cultural brand, and there are literally kids in Paris and Milan wearing clothes named after streets and pubs in Blackburn. So more fool the people who use those classifications without knowing. In terms of what we have to do, Ian, I mean, what we do. You know, we have to keep doing what we do. But the most important thing is not about the perception of it. It's about the quality of culture. So we have to make it. It's important that that we still make visible. Cynthia and I talked about this when we first met, when Rebecca introduced us. That the great thing about the collectors is that they brought this stuff to this place and they left it to the people of this place. This incredibly rich cultural artifacts, these scholarly artifacts, and somebody bought the Sharples painting and kept it for us and made visible these cultures. And the Textile Biennial and the Festival of Making does all that. So it's about continuing that curiosity of collecting, that we retain the cultures that emerge and that they're available to people. That's what our museum's for. That's what our festivals are for. And that people like you, Ian, because I know you're an artist, continue to make work here, and that we can make that visible through Prism Contemporary and through all of the mechanics of culture that we've got. But really, ultimately, that culture is retained. And in that way, it doesn't. I don't want to have a culture war and say that I don't want to be the northern guy who says I'm not interested in opera now, because that's also a trap. Because that's not what Hart and Dunn are about, and it's not what Bilington were about. You know, there's a rich breadth of culture, so we have to make it visible, and retain it. That's the answer.
Great answer too. Thanks, Jamie. Cynthia, have you got something you'd like to add in to this?
Yeah, I think that Jamie and I have been talking a lot about cultures collecting now, and that what people are collecting in Blackburn now being part of sort of the cultural mix. I think Jamie's idea of future heritage is where we'd like to see the conversation go. I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm not going to labour it, but it's that the James Sharples painting is the classic example.
Yeah.
Of, at the time, it wasn't that, you know, that's what the world looked like.
Yeah.
But now, but by it being retained, and I know that the museum had to fight to keep it as well, but it could quite as easily have gone in a skip as well, as like much of these artifacts have done. So we need our Dunns, and we need our Harts, and we need our museums, and we need this stuff to be retained and collected. And someone needs to get, that's the next conversation. It's a great conversation, Cynthia. What should we be collecting?
I'm going to bring in Erin's question, actually, because it's the same thing. So I'll read this out in full, but it's a development of that. I've really enjoyed hearing about your work, Cynthia and Jamie, and seeing lots of parallels with Dundee, where I am. I would be interested to know what sort of material you think local collectors, libraries, archives should be collecting now to continue this work and reflect the creativity and life of a place for the future. And I suppose you can be open with place. You could talk about Blackburn, Erin's in Dundee, but I suppose generally, what are the kind of things that we will collect to reflect place?
Cynthia, do you want to go or?
No, I'd let you go first.
Okay. Well, I think there's two things that you. The great thing about Hart and Dunn is that they resist the provincial trap. It can't just be provincial.
Yeah.
So Cynthia told me a great story about one of the manuscripts, and she really, it's really engaging. We were talking about a pigment, blue. We were talking about the blue pigment, right, Cynthia?
Yeah.
From Afghanistan, it comes down the mountains from Afghanistan, and eventually is manifesting this artwork that ends up in Blackburn, and it's this. All of this rich culture and history comes with it, and dialogue and curiosity, and all of these fabulous things that art does at its very, very best. And we need that as well. So that it's to avoid the provincial trap in Dundee or Blackburn or Bolton or Seaham or whatever, but also that you have to capture this. So I think capturing the work that is being made here now, my work, Ian's work, the stuff coming out of Prism, that is key. Gary Atherton's trainers collection should be in there. We've got enough clogs. There are. We've got to avoid the nostalgia trap, and we've got to take a chance on and take risks on emerging cultures. And I'm not knocking the museum either, because if you could go in there now, Kick Down the Barriers reveals our communities and cultures. Sima's paintings. I didn't know about Sima. Sima also died at painting, not gone to art school. Fabulous paintings. Someone buy those paintings and put them in a collection, because that's a kind of thing that we need.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I mean, I think it's important to think about collecting things that are made in the community and things that people bring to the community. That's sort of continuing this chain of sort of future heritage, I think.
Thank you both. Good answers and a good question, Erin. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Erin. Great question.
Yeah. I've been interested in class across this, and Claire's asked a question. Claire Lees, and it's not about class necessarily, but I know, Jamie, you would go this route, I think. But Claire's question is, fabulous presentations by Cynthia and Jamie, and thank you for that, Claire. I'm interested in how creativity and learning offered freedom for self-expression, art making and community building. Can you both comment a bit more on this? And I'd just add to this, I think that is very contemporary as an issue now, because it was really interesting that you talked about Hart going to Cambridge, which I kind of expected, it'd go down, but to do mechanical engineering. And there was this sense of everything being workplace, and the only function of education was work linked to skills, function, work, employment. And there's very strong echoes to now, I think, in what we see education as. But back to Claire's question. What do you think about that creativity and learning are offering freedom for self-expression, art making, community building? Is that what you saw in the poets especially, but also in the collectors? Was that something that they were into? Is that the purpose behind collection? Either of you start with that.
Yeah, I sort of think that I'm not sure if Hart starts collecting with any community purpose. I think it's in the air, as I was saying, it's part of this whole Ruskinian sort of, the curation of the self. But at some point, it segues to curation or enrichment of the community, done at some point in his life. And he does this before Hart. And I think it's really important that Hart, who is, he's from a smarter sort of, social set or whatever in Blackburn, that Hart follows Dunn's lead in terms of leaving this stuff to leaving his collection, his beloved collection that he had spent his money and traveled all over the world to create. He leaves it to the town, and in the front of every book, Dunn's handwriting. And actually, I found this really moving working in the archives, making my way through his 500 books. And every single book, there's a little slip of paper. He's ruled it himself. He writes it in pencil. and there are a lot of misspellings, but he's going to get it. He's going to get down exactly why the book is in there and why it's in his collection and why it's important for the people of the town. There's a reason. So I see there's a lot of sort of creativity and curation and enrichment of communities through this act of collecting. Jamie, did you want to say?
Have you got anything to?
Yeah, I mean, I agree, obviously, completely with Cynthia. I think in terms of, if I understand the question, where creativity manifests, it does form cultures. It does form communities, and these spaces form those communities. And it's a mistake not to think that learning and scholarship doesn't take place in these other spaces as well. Because I think back to Bilington, when he was talking about the future, he was excited by the prospect of access to education. This technical building was being built, this incredible, beautiful building, and it was access, much like the NHS would be something similar later. So it was coming to this town and people were going to get access to learning. And that, the learning happened before then, obviously, and it continues to manifest outside of those walls as well. And I think that the impact of these spaces is that the stuff that excites me most is where the learning manifests in different ways, and whether that's in football grounds, through singing, through oral traditions of singing, or whether it's in the workplace, that it's not that the learning isn't restricted just to what we might think of being these formal spaces of learning. And that's when cultures really get enriched, when it crosses over. And that, right back to the example I made before of Kick Down the Barriers Commission that Sophie Skellen and Rebecca have been running. It's interesting to pull all of that stuff together into new communities. So there's academic communities in there and communities outside of, and that's what these spaces are for. It's a mistake to keep them separate, and it's a mistake to think that they're exclusive, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I really, really agree with that.
Great points. I've had the push now. We're over time, but we're going to take about 5 minutes to bring it together. I just so entranced by the whole thing. I didn't even look at a clock. Even though yours didn't chime on time, Cynthia. So I'll just bring these last questions in because I don't want to leave anybody unsaid. Ken asks, have you looked at Thomas Boyes Lewis's plays? And he's the one that's collected the Japanese prints in the museum. And David says, can collecting be seen as a means of showing that after being successful in business, they had something beyond just making money? So would that be a rationale for the collections? The two very different questions, but how would you deal with those? What would your response be if we can bring that together? Cynthia?
So sorry, the last one was sort of in terms of something besides making money.
Yeah, I think rather that maybe the rationale was that the collecting was, we've made our money, but we need to do something else with that money rather than just collect money and have sort of full with.
Yeah, I also think that thinking about, for Hart anyway, the sort of religious element, he wasn't a person who liked to show off. I showed their family house, and it's really nice. It's a big house, but it's not super grand. And we've got an oral history given by Hart's parlourmaid, Peggy Morris, who worked for the Harts for 12 years. She came back to Blackburn in the 70s as an old lady, and she sort of gave her history, her memories of working for the family. And it's a really simple life. You get up, you go to work, you take the tram, you always wear galoshes, you come back, you have your tea, you go upstairs, you look at your books and your coins. That's what you do. And I think
£1 million in a bag and go to London. That's true, though.
yeah. And you don't, and actually, and I meant to say, at the end of that story, Mr. Maggs asks Hart, he says, Mr. Hart, tell me, why do you prefer to pay in this way? And he says, because I'd prefer that my bankers don't know how much I'm spending on books. Yeah. So, I think for him, this whole thing about transform and escape the dogs. Okay. Hart's born into this rope making family. He doesn't have a choice. I don't think. He's the eldest son. He's going to run the business. That's it. That's it. And so for him, this is his chance to transform. And I think he sees later, maybe following Dunn's example, it's a chance to transform also sort of cultural depth of his community. It's a bit of freedom. It's what, I don't know. I think it's a huge interior life that he has.
Okay. Thank you, Cynthia. Just as an aside, back to Ken Ford's question. Thanks, Ken. Have you looked at Thomas Boyd Lewis's plays? Do you know that Thomas Boyd Lewis's?
Yes, I have. Yeah. So it's the biggest collection of religious icons in the UK, which is in the Blackburn Museum, collected by Thomas Boyd Lewis. Also went to Cambridge, read classics, came back to Blackburn, ran the family mill. And but he retires early, and he spends the rest of his life teaching Latin and Greek in the Blackburn College. So that's what he does. And it's also, we think it might be at one point, it was the largest collection of Japanese prints in the UK. That collection is fabulous. But that's not my specialty anyway.
I suppose we're at that point now where we're going to have to, I'm going to give you about a minute each to close. Is there any summary of today? It's been absolutely fabulous, and the discussion's been as good as the presentations. Is there anything you'd like to leave us with as a last and final goodbye?
Yeah, mine is buy artwork if you can. You can buy some artwork off graduates and young artists in Blackburn, 10, 20, 30 quid, and you start your own collection. It's really that easy. And then for the people who are in the heart end of the gig, buy work for these museums and put it in there, and take a chance on contemporary culture. It's really easy to. I'm as enamored with the past and with this culture as anyone, but it's a mistake to think that we haven't got exciting contemporary cultures. And you can collect on all levels, every level. So, it's a tough time, but if you've got a tenner, buy an artwork of a local artist for someone else for Christmas. And if you've got a bit more, buy a banner off me and stick it in the museum.
Thanks, Jamie. Thank you. Cynthia?
Yeah, and for me, it's when you can, come to the museum.
Yeah.
Walk around inside, look at the stuff. When I first came to Blackburn, to the Blackburn Museum, as a book historian, I walked in there and I had no idea what I was walking into. It was the biggest display of rare books that I had seen anywhere outside of the British Library. That's how incredible it is. Get in there and see it. It's phenomenal.
Thanks, Cynthia. That's a great way to end it. The chat's very, very positive. Lots of beautiful thank yous and comments about how good and how enjoyable people have found it. And I just want to, on behalf of everybody, thank you for your questions. They've been superb questions and taken us in lots of different directions. Thank you for that. And to Cynthia and to Jamie, I just want to say thank you very much. It's been really exciting, really interesting, fascinating, in fact. And I just want to say good night to everybody now. Do more with the Being Human Festival if you can, and please give us some feedback so that it justifies the continuation of these type of events. So anything you can put on there, positive stuff, I hope. So, thank you, and goodbye.